Welcome to Tulane parents. My name is Penny Wyatt, and I am the Director of Parent Programs and External Relations for the Division of Student Affairs at Tulane. I'm going to give a little bit of preliminary information while we're waiting for everybody to log in, get settled. So I thank you for joining us today. I know some of you may have participated in our other webinars earlier this week. We had one on Tuesday, one yesterday, and there will be another one tomorrow at 2 p.m. Central on the fall 2020 move-in process, which I know is something that you're all very, very interested in. And so please remember that you've got those, that you can listen to the recordings. We'll have those available next week on the Parent Programs website. And you can still log into tomorrow's to register for that. So our topic today is going to be very focused on accessibility at Tulane. And Patrick Randolph, who is the director of the Goldman Center for Student Accessibility, will be our speaker. But before I turn things over to him, I'm going to show you some details for how we will proceed today. So first of all, I just want to apologize if there is background noise behind me. I'm so sorry if that happens. I'll try to speak really clearly just in case. I don't have a cat who might wander across the screen or a child who might come up to play, but there is construction going on right beside me today that I don't have any control over. So I hope that noise won't interfere, but I want to apologize in advance if you hear some extra noise. Luckily, I'm not the one doing most of the talking today, so I hope that won't be a distraction. So just to let you know how we'll proceed. Today we're in webinar format. So that means that your microphones are muted. This is different from a Zoom meeting format. And the chat is disabled. So you're not chatting back and forth among yourselves. The communication will come from you to us using the Q&A feature in your controls. So you can submit questions, but we ask that you hold all your questions until I cue you to submit your questions. And since you also had the chance when you registered to submit a question in advance, Patrick has already reviewed those and identified some, in advance that he can focus on, but he's very well versed in all of this and has presented this topic in other ways prior years. So he knows what to expect and he knows how to present information to you. I also want to just tell you that we will send some follow-up information, or it'll be available in terms of the links that you can use to access the website for the Goldman Center. So I would encourage you to just absorb, just listen to everything really carefully, but don't feel like you have to scribble down notes the whole time in a way that might keep you from fully listening, because you'll get some of that follow-up information later. So, and if you need to leave, if you can't stay the whole time with us today, the link to the video will be posted next week. In fact, it may be best to kind of wait until about July 1st for everything to be up on the Parent Programs website. And you'll see there that we have an archive of other parent webinars that have been presented in the past. So while we have some special information, some very specific COVID-19 precautions related information or new procedures, because of that, such as the one that'll be presented tomorrow on move-in, we have usually presented this kind of information to parents during the summer, this very critical summer in the transition of your student's life between high school and college. We know that that is also a significant transition in your life too. So in prior years, when the CAST program was in person on campus, And parents also had some presentations that they could attend or other ways to interact with these valuable resource folks like Patrick on our campus. And since that was shifted to go virtually for all the students, then we created some more of these topical webinars to do this summer to bring you up to speed or provide more depth of information for you to have more knowledge about the different resources at Tulane. And I do want to say that this is not so that you need to remember all of these things in significant detail and that you need to manage these things for your student. We fully expect that your student is going to learn to take all of these things on, but we certainly understand that prior to this point, you have been the manager for a lot of these things. So we want you to know how to assist your students, especially in this startup time, this foundational time of their college career. And so we want to provide this information to help you do that. And also so that if issues come up later for your student and they seem to be confused about where to go, you can gently return them back to us and guide them and say, oh, I remember that information on the webinar, or remember reading about that in the parent e-newsletter. There are people there to help you. Let me look that up and remind you, or, you know, I think you're going to find that through Tulane College or something like that. So, so that's our purpose, not so that you feel overwhelmed with more things to do, but that you feel guided to understand all of the rich support system that we provide for students here. So I think then without further ado, I will turn things over to Patrick.
Thank you, Penny, and thank all of you new parents for joining us today. Just to give you a little bit of perspective so that hopefully I can best address some of your concerns and questions. I've been with Tulane and in this role at the Goldman Center, which is essentially Tulane's version of disability services, since 2009, so a little over a decade now. I'm also a fellow parent. My daughter graduated from Tulane in 2018, so I really try to embrace the work that I do by focusing on looking at things through the lens of a parent, not really so much as an administrator. So take a lot of care and concern for your students when you send them to us. And also for those of you who are sending your kids far away, which most Tulane students come from far away, I have a rising sophomore in college at another university, so I know what that feeling's like as well. So hopefully the information I share with you today is useful and relatable. But I am going to do my best to keep it pretty brief, because I know that a lot of you have individual questions that apply to really specific circumstances, and I want to afford us enough space to address those questions as best we can. Some of those may duplicate and may help more than one family, but I do want to make sure I'm addressing your needs and not just giving you the information I think you want to hear. To dive right in though, the Goldman Center, again, as I referenced, it's our version here at Tulane of disability services. And obviously our primary goal is to eliminate barriers and to promote accessibility for every member of the Tulane community. That looks different for lots of different people, but it is an overarching objective that we take very seriously at the Goldman Center. And a lot of the work that we do obviously is highly reactive in nature. You know, a student has to reach out to us and tell us what types of accommodation support they're looking for, and then we address those needs. But we also have a really strong desire to help the larger campus community understand that, particularly in the classrooms and for professors and faculty on staff, helping them to understand that there's no two students that learn exactly the same way in their classrooms. So that second bullet point in bold, we reference the great minds think differently. That's kind of our tagline here at the Goldman Center. And so for us, it's not so much about conforming or getting things to look a certain way. It's more about having flexibility built into all that we do to ideally one day provide an organically accessible experience to all students, and hopefully one day really negate the need for them to have to check in or self-identify and register with the Goldman Center to get the support that we need. Admittedly, we're still a ways off from that lofty objective, but that is our goal, and that is the way we approach our day-to-day work. Penny, can you go to the next slide, please? There we go. So as I mentioned before, a lot of what we do is highly reactive in nature in the sense that students come to us with a specific request, and then we address that request through an interactive process to determine what reasonable accommodations those students are entitled to under the protections of the ADA. As I'm sure you can imagine, most of those requests are heavily academics related, right? Most of the students that come to us are seeking testing accommodations. Most commonly requested is extended time. A lot of students benefit from having access to a less distracting environment for testing as well. We also work with students to support them in the classroom. It could be something like providing transcription services to a student that is deaf or hard of hearing. It also could be providing some other type of note-taking support or other permissions in the classroom to make sure that they have an unrestricted experience in the way that they engage in classroom spaces, and really just to make sure that they have an unobstructed way to access information the same way as their non-disabled peers would access that information. Outside of the academic arena, we also provide consideration for housing accommodations. The housing accommodations, they do have to be disability specific and necessary to ensure equal access. We are not in the business of honoring preferences. There are platforms available to assess those types of needs through housing, but for the Goldman Center specifically, our goal is to make sure that every student has all of their needs met in their housing environment. So that is another really highlighted area that we really focus on, particularly this time of year with your new students getting ready to come in. And lastly, although we consider any type of request, I think the last most commonly requested accommodation is relative to dining needs. And I believe that there were even some questions that were submitted prior to the webinar today, kind of addressing some of those concerns. And what I think is most critical for you to know is that Tulane's campus vendor who provides food services for us, Sodexo, they actually do a really phenomenal job of addressing and meeting not just the needs of students with disabilities, but also the lifestyle choices of students that opt to go vegan or choose to go gluten-free. Maybe they don't have a celiac disorder or some other type of disorder that might necessitate food accommodations or dining accommodations, but they work with students to meet their preferences as well. So the reason I wanted to share that with you is because a great place to start if you have concerns about your students' nutrition is with dining services and with the dietitian through Sodexo to assess whether or not they can meet your needs or your students' needs reasonably. And if they can't, then that's a fantastic time to connect with us so that we can assess their eligibility under ADA protections. Next slide, please, Penny. So I think for both students, but even for parents in particular, as you're making this transition from the K through 12 environment into the post-secondary environment, for many of you, this is your first student that's going off to a post-secondary institution. And so I felt like just taking a few moments to clarify a little bit in terms of expectations regarding eligibilities might make good sense and might help people understand the kind of the framework with which we address student requests. So in the K through 12 environment, accommodations are really kind of monitored under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And the way that that program is really set up is geared toward ensuring students' success. And the reason why it's set up that way is because in the K through 12 arena, or just in the United States, all students have the right to an education through high school. Going into the post-secondary arena, that is viewed fundamentally as more of a privilege, not a right. And as much as we want to see as many students get to that level of education as possible, the standards change a little bit with respect to how we support students. So, you know, technically, or I guess informally, my goal for all students is to make sure that they have every opportunity to be successful, and anything I can do to help contribute to that, formally or informally, I'm happy to. But in my role at the university, my job is about establishing what student needs are to ensure equal access. And so a lot of times students, particularly, we're seeing a growing number of students on Tulane's campus and in post-secondary institutions in general, more and more anxiety diagnoses, a lot of concerns and disorders that relate to perfectionistic tendencies and having desired outcomes. It may be that your student is an AB student, or they have been throughout high school, and just because they may be struggling in a class where they're performing on a more average level, that alone may not be an indicator that they would be eligible for services. We really try to look at how your students' needs compare to the general population here at Tulane. And so a lot of that drives the work that we do. The other primary difference that's referenced on the slides is in the K through 12 environment, schools have to go out and actually identify students that need these types of supports. And in the post-secondary environment, and particularly at Tulane, a student has to self-identify. I'm assuming that most of your students are already perfectly willing to make that step, or else you wouldn't be on the call today. But I do feel like it's important to highlight that your student does need to be a part of that process. Here at Tulane, myself and my staff, we really pride ourselves on kind of embracing the social model of disability. So we focus a lot less on the mechanical aspects of how disability was diagnosed and really how it's been treated, and kind of how things maybe historically, even through the K through 12 experience, your own experiences may have felt very medical heavy. That type of documentation and that type of support is obviously very helpful, particularly with respect to clarifying what student needs are. But in our social model approach, we really value the student's self-report in this process. And what we find out, or what I have found out in my 10+ years in this role, is that parent expectations of student needs does not always very nicely align with what the student feels like their needs are. So we sometimes have students, or we have parents reach out and ask for assistance, and they tell us, but my student can never know about this. Well, then I can't reasonably support your student. So they do have to be an integral component in this process, and they are going to be expected to actively participate in the process if it is something that they want to consider. So we'd be happy to connect with individual families after the fact if we need to discuss any of this, particularly as we're processing your student's request. But I do feel like that is a really critical piece of the puzzle that's helpful for everyone on the call to know today. Next slide, please, Penny. So in terms of who we serve, again, most of you, if you're dialing in today and you're a part of this webinar, it's because you either know your student has some support needs that can be managed through the Goldman Center, or you suspect they do. And we welcome and encourage all of those students to connect with us if they've not yet done so. Quite obviously, the students, kind of our bread and butter, are the students that come to us that know they have a history of receiving accommodations in their K through 12 experience. And they want to see what eligibilities they have, or roll those same accommodations over into the post-secondary arena. And by and large, that accommodation transfer is pretty seamless, and it ends up, in most instances, we're able to approve the same types of accommodation supports that students received in their high school experience. There are rare exceptions where the types of accommodations students receive don't as nicely align as one might want. But part of that disconnect, I would say, is we want to make sure at Tulane that we're not only meeting the needs of your student, but that we're preparing them for life outside of Tulane. And so we rely less on things like peers to help with providing note support, and rely more on implementing various forms of assistive technology to assist your student in getting the support they need to access lecture content. So the accommodations might look a little bit different than what they've had in high school, but I assure you they are equally effective. And everything that we do is a work in progress too. So we can continue to experiment with things and work with your student one-on-one to make sure their needs are fully met. And that may change from year to year depending on their classes and how their condition may manifest. One of the other key categories of students that I think is really important to focus on are students that have maybe have a history of academic struggles in specific areas, right? Maybe they've always complained about not being a strong reader, or a slow reader, or I'm not good at math. Your student may have conditions that impact their learning experience that have not been formally diagnosed, or that you may not even feel like have been impactful enough in their K through 12 experience to necessitate the implementation of accommodations. College is different, right? And at Tulane, students are going to be coming in They're going to have a lot more autonomy. They're going to have a lot less structure than is inherently built into their day at home, where you're preparing meals for them. They wake up the same time every day. Their class is in the same time every day. Everything's much more fluid in college, and those things can really make academic challenges for students with diagnosed disorders or not. They can make those challenges really rise to the surface in such a way where areas where they used to maybe be able to get by, they're not able to get by anymore. So definitely don't want you to think that you have to have a prior history of receiving accommodations to receive consideration now. We have medical and law school students that come to us for the very first time, and we find that they're eligible for support. The same applies to your newly admitted undergraduate student as well. That's also not just, it's not a time limited offer. They don't have to figure that out now. Their needs, again, could change, and they could need more support later on in their experience as a student at Tulane. The last group that I would ask you to be really mindful about are not just for your own student, because again, if you're on this call today, you probably already suspect they have some needs, but for their friends, for other family members, for people that you grow these really strong connections that Tulane is famous for having with alumni, with other parents. Students sometimes come to Tulane and have never had any challenges academically, more often than not because they are really, really bright, and maybe those challenges did exist. They just didn't hold them back the way they might some other students. There's also a small contingent of mental health disorders that tend to manifest, regrettably, around this time in your student's life, right? Late adolescence, early adulthood. There may be some pre-existing symptoms that you've noticed about your student, but it's never really, again, risen to that level where you felt like it needed to be addressed. Again, your student may have no challenges right now, but they could encounter some in the future, mental health or otherwise, also acquired injuries, things like that. We don't wish that on any student, but sometimes things happen. So, please hang on to this information, share it with your students' friends, other parents, make sure they know they can connect with us with any time for support. And really kind of the approach we take to support, obviously we're here to provide disability support services, but myself and my entire team, we really view ourselves more as student support, not disability support. And so if your student establishes a connection with us, we want them to feel comfortable coming in and knowing they can talk to us about anything. And if it's something we can help them with, we're always more than happy to. Sometimes that help is available in a more comprehensive way through another resource outside of our office, and we're always happy to connect students to those resources as well. I think we're good there, Penny. Next slide, please. So before I jump into questions, I wanted to share our contact page. You can find a lot of information about the support services available through the Goldman Center on our website, which is just accessibility.tulane.edu. This is where you would start. For those of you that are curious who have not yet started the request process, this is where you can find the accommodation request form. The way the online portal works is your student would go in, fill out a brief questionnaire, and at the bottom of that questionnaire, there's a space for them to list whatever accommodations they're seeking. And then after they submit that, your student will receive an automatically generated email acknowledging the receipt of that request. And embedded in that email will have a confidentially secure link where your student can upload any supporting documentation they have with respect to their request. Once we have both the student's request and their supporting documentation, even if it's limited, we will reach out to your student and ask them to contact the office to schedule a welcome meeting either with myself or one of our access coordinators. And not to get too lost in the details, but to give you a little bit of an overview, the same online platform that is used for students to request their accommodations, that's what's used to manage accommodations. So every high school has kind of a different procedure. Every college has a different procedure. But for us at Tulane, everything is through our online platform. So students do have an obligation to go in each semester to update and activate their accommodations. Primarily just because their teachers change from semester to semester and they need to be notified. But it's a really fluid, seamless process once they get used to it. And once they're activating their accommodations, our system automatically generates notification emails that get sent to their respective professors, acknowledging whatever accommodations they're approved for that they've chosen to activate in that class. So some of those are kind of like devils in the details, so to speak, and we will work very closely with your student when we connect with them to make sure they know exactly how to manage the activation process. Um, but it is pretty streamlined. We share tutorials, but I just want you all to know that things are set up in a very intentional way to make sure that students, as little as possible, have to go outside of the scope or the realm of what their non-disabled peers have to do in order to get the access that they deserve. So really intentional about that, and we're always looking for ways to improve, and we encourage that feedback. But that, I think, in a nutshell, is kind of an overview of what we do, and I'm happy to answer some specific questions now if you want to start sending them Penny's way. Penny, you are muted right now.
Sorry.
Okay.
So thanks, Patrick. So if you may begin submitting questions in that box.
I had one that was already up if you want me to take one.
Sure.
So one of the questions that I had, or a couple of the questions were, assistance with executive function deficiencies that maybe don't quite qualify or haven't qualified historically as a disability, and also just how to support students, regardless of their diagnosis or their qualifying disability, connecting to all the resources that are available on campus without feeling overwhelmed. So if you were on the call yesterday, one of our strongest campus partners is the Success Center. Kimberly Charlesworth presented yesterday, and we have a strong collaborative, reciprocating working relationship with them. Because as I'm sure you can imagine, the services that they provide are often in areas where a lot of students connected with the Goldman Center are deficient in the areas of executive function, planning, procrastination, time management, organization, study skills, some really basic things that surprisingly a lot of students come to Tulane and they're not as well buttoned up in those areas as maybe they should be. Variety of reasons for that. Doesn't really matter what the reasons are, but we want you to know we do have comprehensive support available for those students. Kimberly mentioned yesterday that every incoming freshman student is receiving an invitation to connect with one of their success coaches. Whether you know your student has known challenges or not, it is something that I recommend every student take advantage of. There's a hefty price tag associated with sending your child to Tulane. I get that, I understand it. This is one of those services that's included in that premium. And so I really encourage you to take advantage of that. In terms of coordinating services across offices, what I typically encourage students to do is to, establish a strong connection with whoever feels most comfortable to them, right? So it might be their therapist in CAPS can help connect them to other resources. It could be myself or someone in my shop that can help. It could be someone from Kimberly and her team in Success that coordinates and facilitates those initial meetings. What I find is that typically the frequency and the need for those meetings is a little greater when students first come in. And then once they get settled in a little bit more, figure out some things, they find their path. But there's a lot of assistance to help students with that. And if they don't have anywhere else to know to go and they reach out to you for help, send them to us, whether they're coming for accommodations or not. Someone from my team would be happy to assist.
So Patrick, here's a question. If we have already uploaded documentation to you and gotten a confirmation, does that mean we're registered with you and my son will automatically get that email asking for him to schedule the welcome meeting?
My hunch is that your son probably already got that email, maybe not, but what happens more often than not when we get those types of questions or phone calls, there is an email in the student's new Tulane email, and particularly for our new students that aren't on campus yet, they haven't really made checking their Tulane email a priority or a habit, but there may already be something. If not, you're welcome to call the office, and if we've not yet reached out to set up that welcome meeting, we can do so over the phone and set up something and get it prepared and organized in really short order.
Okay, here is another question. Our son was set up for updated testing this summer, which is postponed due to COVID. It would be a full day one-on-one testing situation. Will his testing, which is currently 3.5 years old, be sufficient until he can retest post-vaccine?
So that's a really fantastic question, and I'm glad you brought it up because, again, when I was speaking philosophically about how we approach eligibility at Tulane, we really subscribe more to the social model of disability more so than the medical model. So that information is helpful, and I know a lot of universities and a lot of licensing boards, credentialing agencies, testing agencies have really strict guidelines in terms of the timeliness of the documentation. We tend to be more liberal with that. And we also realize that those evaluations are really time consuming and they're also very costly. So we would not want you having to go through that additional testing unless it's absolutely necessary. Um, it kind of offsets, right? Like the older your documentation is, the more compelling of an argument we would need within that documentation to overlook the age of the documentation. Or if an evaluation from 4 or 5 years ago references a history of evaluations every 3 years prior to that, we can get a pretty clean picture of what a student's needs are without fully anticipating those to change drastically over time. I will tell you this, when your student meets with one of our access coordinators, they might want to mention that so that if there are any concerns about the recency of the documentation, they'll know that there's that added barrier of not having access to evaluations right now, which is impacting students all over the country. But that is something we can work around. We also, too, when we just have questions about things, we tend, again, in more of a liberal approach to the way we support students. It's not uncommon for us to provisionally approve a student for a semester to afford them the time that they need to get the documentation that they need if there are gaps in the evidence that we need to support that approval. So I apologize, and that's a really long answer, but it really just depends on the circumstances, the diagnosis, and what is available. So that should not be a barrier to applying, though. Submit what you have. We'll consider whatever you have. It might be enough. The one caveat I'll add, I mentioned not wanting to burden families with additional expenses for these evaluations. You might, even if we don't need an updated evaluation, a graduate school or the GRE or the LSAT or the MCAT, whatever lofty aspirations your student has in terms of their academics, there might be a need for them to get an updated evaluation for another agency or another organization or school down the road. But for us, once you're in and you're approved permanently, you're good to go for the rest of your time at Tulane, including if you transition into a graduate or professional program like the School of Law or School of Medicine.
Okay, so here's another question, and I think they just need to hear this sort of reiterated to make sure they heard this correctly. The question is, so it's not necessary for the student to approach each professor on the first day of each semester to inform the professor of the accommodation. Instead, that notice happens electronically and automatically.
That is correct. I will say, depending on what your student's accommodation needs are, they may want to connect with their professor at some point. So for many professors, if a student has a basic extended time accommodation, particularly if it's a professor who's been around for a while, they're familiar with us, they already have a plan mapped out, they may take the initiative, and during syllabus day, when they're going over the syllabus with the students, they may just throw out exactly what they expect from the student with respect to accommodated testing and what they need to do to fulfill their responsibilities. If that type of announcement doesn't already exist in the syllabus, or there's not a verbal announcement about that, we do encourage your student to connect with their professor either via email or in person during their office hours, to just have a conversation and say, like, hey, you should have received notice of my approvals. I know we have a test coming up in 2 weeks, and I just wanted to make sure that I'm doing everything I need to do on my end to get the extended time I'm approved for. Most professors embrace that conversation, particularly if it's not 2 hours before the exam. So again, making sure that the students are reasonable with timelines, that's really what's key. But yes, most of it is facilitated electronically. Again, a few caveats, but if your student has any of those exceptions, we would work with them one-on-one to make sure they get the support they need.
So here's a very timely question. Given the COVID-19 situation, we're not really prepared for unforeseen issues that may come up for a student with general anxiety disorder. Who should they work with? Our student will be hesitant to ask for help proactively. Should we alert your office?
That's a really good question. I think that it really depends on what your student is willing to do and what their needs are in the moment, right? I think that if you know your student either already has a diagnosed anxiety disorder or shows signs of anxiety that you feel like could be impactful to their academic experience, and even worse, might be exacerbated by the current climate that we're all living in, racial tensions or COVID related. I think that establishing an appropriate level of therapeutic care is really key. Some students come in with an existing provider. We do encourage students customarily to consider connecting, not fracturing the relationship with their existing provider altogether, but we do think there's a tremendous amount of value with connecting with a local, either on-campus or off-campus therapist for mental health support, depending on your student's needs. And sometimes, they feel like they're fine and don't need to do that. But what I've learned in my time here, and educationally, I'm trained as a therapist as well, even though that's not the role I play here. Students are far less inclined to connect with counseling services in a moment of panic or urgency when they have the added stress of wondering who are they going to meet with, will they connect with them, is it going to be a good match. So I think as much as you see necessary, establishing a connection with somebody in advance of that need is a smart thing to do. I'll also say, though, given the current climate, a lot of therapists have transferred to teletherapy. And so if your student already has an established teletherapy relationship, then you may just be able to continue, or they may be able to continue in that capacity without interruption. But I would encourage you to just think about those needs. But again, if you have a student that is struggling, anxiety related or otherwise, and don't know who to turn to, they absolutely can reach out. And you can as well. We help parents all the time. Again, we really like, as Penny mentioned at the beginning, for students to take the lead. It really gives us a clearer picture of what their needs are when they reach out directly. But always happy to help, both students and parents. Feel free to reach out.
So there are a couple of questions with similar issues that I want to address because there's another resource for students about these. So one of the questions was, does your office assist with medication management, coordinating medicine with accommodations? And I think Patrick would agree that would fall to our student health center. And then there was another question about how do you work with the CAPS Counseling Center, which Patrick just mentioned, but I will alert you to the fact that there have been a couple of articles in the parent e-newsletters. So if you'll go back and look at those, and they're archived on the parents.tulane.edu website if you missed them or lost them or if you deleted them, that refer to our health center and different things, especially about care coordination. And so if it would seem advisable for your student to match up with an off-campus provider so they can maintain a continuity of care and maybe more frequent counseling sessions, then we would provide it in our short-term counseling model with the counseling center on campus. Then there is you don't have to crowdsource that from the few people you might know or not know in New Orleans. You have someone on campus you can call or email who has information about that to help make referrals to you for people who are willing to take Tulane students as clients. They kind of know something about insurance issues that students might have. They can also recommend people who are closer to campus or more accessible to our students in terms of where they're located in the city. That's all really valuable information, and I think it's a terribly underutilized resource for parents. So I want you to know about that. So it's listed on the website under care coordination. The other thing that I would mention is that we will have a webinar in late July that will be about learning to education and support for health, wellness, and self-care. So that's a big new area of just life skills that students need to acquire once they are in this phase of emerging adulthood. To this point, you've always managed that and overseen that for them. And so there's a lot of education that we do about how students can do that, support for them about how to learn how to, utilize those services. and especially with proactive kinds of things about, wellness habits and knowledge to acquire so that they can, not just wait until there's a problem, but, manage their wellness. So that's a really great webinar to tune into in late July. That could give you a lot of that other background. But there's also great information on campushealth.tulane.edu. And if you look at the top of the screen where there's some navigation tabs, there's one that's labeled especially for. And if you do the drop-down list, there's one especially for parents and guardians. So it's really set up to kind of be your portal into understanding all of those different resources. So if you want to get a preview of that now before that webinar happens, then I encourage you to go ahead and take a look at those. And so that's it's part of your student's life, but it's not necessarily managed by Patrick's office. Patrick would agree that that's kind of where those things go. So let's see, some other questions then. If my child is flailing, like organization or time management, will that be caught or flagged before it becomes reflected in bad grades? So I'd like to mention a couple of things first, Patrick, that are very general to folks, even sort of beyond this. But a couple of things to know are that professors can, if they see some issues, they can reach out to advisors to recommend services or some follow-up or some outreach from our specialized units that provide that. So while it might not be the Goldman Center, organization and time management are going to fall more under the whole success coaching rubric. But another thing to be aware of, and this is a good thing for parents to know, is that at Tulane, we provide midterm grades. And those are always listed on the academic calendar. So although it's not necessarily like final exams where there are 4 or 5 days where they have all their midterms, they might be kind of spaced out over a few weeks or something, just as the professor creates the syllabus. But there is a date by which professors have to submit all of their midterm grades. And so that usually happens about the first to second week of October. I think that would be correct in this different schedule that we have for the fall. But students will receive those. So it's an early indicator for them of how they're doing in the class. So, the students get the grades, parents do not get the grades. So I guess I would just say for you, it's a good time to kind of know that's coming up, provide some extra encouragement and support, send a care package, check in. But that also happens before the last day to drop a class. So it's a good indicator and a time for the student to kind of get a bird's eye view of how they're doing in all their classes. And they could check in with their advisor and say, this one class is really just kicking me. What would happen? Can I still maintain enough hours that I need if I drop this one? Or maybe it's a time to go to the professor's office hours and say, I'm not doing as well in this class as I would like to. Can you give me some suggestions about what I can do to shore this up? What's your assessment of, how I can do better in the rest of the semester? So that's something to kind of be aware of in terms of that early warning, will something be flagged? So I encourage Patrick to kind of weigh in on this too, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, a couple things. I'd say, if you're asking that question, it's probably because you already have concerns that it could happen to your student. And, having a 19-year-old son, I know how you could feel that way. But I think that, again, reaching out to the Success Center, which your student should have received an email about that to connect with a success coach, I think, insisting that they do it is a really smart move. Also, just kind of on the heels of what Penny was saying, there's actually a system on campus, a campus reporting system. So when professors are noticing any unusual or concerning behavior about a student, maybe they're not taking care of their hygiene, maybe they stop showing up, maybe they participate all the time in class, but their grades aren't reflective of the amount of effort that they're putting in, they can submit a concerns report that goes to the Division of Student Affairs, and then they're essentially, if necessary, can conduct a wellness check on your student in short order to make sure that they have the support that they need. And I would also just say too, because a follow-up to that, some of you may be wondering, well, I've heard some of the classes may still be online. How do they not slip through the cracks in online format? My understanding is actually once they shifted to Zoom platform for learning, actually those reports went up. professors were more aware of when their students were and were not present, or if they noticed any concerning behaviors. So it's a system that has worked for many, many years, and it remains in place, and it really does catch the bulk of the students before they fall through the cracks.
Now, it's very reliant on the student responding back if somebody reaches out to them from one of these helpful offices. So sometimes we'll hear that students kind of ignore those. So I think that one of the best things parents can do is to normalize that the first year especially is a time of great transition, and there's a lot of new information and systems to learn, and knowledge about resources that they have to acquire. And as they do that, as they kind of master that, then they shore up all of those different supports that are around them, and that we consider that to be normal and natural, that they learn to use those resources. And so I think that more parents can do to just, nudge your students to not be afraid to reach out and talk to someone. Or if they get an email, it's not that they're in trouble, it's that someone cares, and that they're providing that quick shortcut to find the support and help that they need. So, so I would just say, it does require that students follow through, even in those times when we initiate the contact. But the biggest thing is to help students understand that there's a lot to learn and not be frustrated that so many things are new, but kind of embrace that and just keep acquiring that knowledge and content mastery of these resources and just the way college works. And know that their resident advisors and their peer mentors for their TIDES class and the WAVE leaders have been through all this. And the reason they want to help students is because they navigated all of this themselves and know that it helps to have an older upper class student kind of showing you the ropes. So if they're a bit hesitant to get on the phone and call an office or send that first email, that talking to one of those peer helpers can also take away some of the mystery about that, and just make it seem a lot more manageable. So that's another thing that you as a parent can do, is remind them to use those folks who signed up for that role of being an extra peer support. So I'm going to transition then to a different question, so different from the peer support. So one parent wants to know, will parents be able to meet with the Goldman Center staff?
So absolutely, if you're ever just coming, if you're on campus and you want to visit us and visit our space, social distancing regulations aside, you are always welcome to come in and meet with us. In terms of your level of participation in the initial welcome meeting, we really let the student drive that ship, right? If they want you to be present during the initial conversation about their needs, we welcome and encourage it, but we certainly don't require it. And we also will not meet with you to discuss your students' needs without them present. If you ever have concerns about your student and you need to reach out to the office, there's a good chance I might listen more than I speak, because we really, again, want to respect the autonomy that students should have in a post-secondary environment, knowing full well that if we had major concerns about your student, you would be contacted, right? We're not gonna, if there's ever an emergency situation or something larger than any disability-related needs, there are mechanisms in place to make sure that the students are supported outside of our office. But for you, we encourage you to contact us and to reach out when necessary. But we also encourage you to, have your student do that for themselves whenever they are capable of doing that. But particularly during that initial transition, the welcome meeting, it's not uncommon at all. Probably the majority of students are accompanied by their parents for that initial dialogue.
Okay, so parents, we're getting kind of close to the end here. So I'm going to say, I'm going to try to get through the last few questions submitted. So I would say if something new comes up, it might be best to email the Goldman Center directly. And Patrick, tell them that email address again.
Yes, it's just goldman@tulane.edu. And then depending on what your question is, your email might get, redirected directly to me, or it may go to one of our staff members.
Okay, so I'm going to try to take a final few. So, um,
Just while you're looking too, I know there were some questions about housing as well. Um, I would say, there's a housing webinar scheduled for tomorrow where I think a lot of these questions could be answered by real authorities, but I don't have information about like dimensions of objects or schematics or layouts, things like that. I think there was one question that was specific to the size of their student and, the bed, whether it's a twin or a twin XL. I do think that there are some dorms that are equipped with twin mattresses, not twin XL. But I've also seen in various places some communications from parents about their kids being well over 6 feet tall, 6'4", 6'5", and they've managed just fine. My son is 6'4", and he's away at college, and as far as I know, he just has a regular single bed, and he does fine in it. So I assume that it'll be okay. But if you have somebody that's maybe in the 7-foot range or somewhere around there, I would definitely ask that question during tomorrow's webinar or reach out to housing to get some information.
and their email address is housing@tulane.edu. Here's one question that's kind of specific, but may be illustrative for several parents and students. My son has Crohn's disease and we're dealing with very weak bones. He'll be commuting since we live nearby. His doctor would like him to have parking accessibility to avoid lots of walking. Is that possible? So is that the type of accommodation that you enter into?
We can assist with that. However, if your student already has a state issued accessible parking placard or accessible parking privileges on their license or license plate, they would just need to go directly to parking services and then they can get that access. I will tell you, like the way parking is set up at all places, not just Tulane, is the number of accessible spaces is determined by the total number of spaces, right? It has to be a percentage of that. And so if somebody does have accessible parking privileges, they need to know it's not always going to be in a space that's designated as an ADA parking space. But your student, if they have those privileges, they would be able to park in any non-reserved, non-metered parking space on campus. It's not just the ADA designated spaces. If there's not, if you reach out to the parking services and they are not very helpful or just don't give you the information you need for some reason, please do connect with me and we can certainly help. And just for many of the parents on the call, probably there's more of you from out of town than in town. It sounds like this student won't be living on campus, but there is also a parking exception form that students can submit if for some reason medical treatment needs, whatever. If there's a medical justification for why they need to have a car on campus first year, that can be considered as well, even though normally it's prohibited.
Yes, normally prohibited to have for students in the first year to have a car on campus. So good to take every opportunity we can to remind people of that. Sometimes people miss that.
But I don't think that would apply to a commuter student. I think that
Right.
that can still be managed just fine.
Right. So this question usually comes up, and I apologize that I didn't state this up front, which I usually try to do. Parents will ask, are you also providing this same information like this for the students? Are the students getting this same webinar? Once this webinar is posted on the website, your students welcome to listen to it or watch the video. But the thing to remember is that your students will be with us for probably 4 years. And they'll be in this environment where we are constantly educating them about these different resources using a variety of media to catch their attention. And like I said, there will be other people who are designated to remind them of these things. So I know one person said, this is a lot to remember. How will they keep track of all this? Is there a flow chart? And so we actually do have some infographics out there about these different things. But let me just tell you about a few things that are just really regular communications and outreach that go to the students. So their wave leaders will be introducing them to a lot of these things during the first 2 to 3 weeks of class. In their TIDES class or their honors colloquia, they will have a peer mentor assigned who has a part of every single class session to deliver some of this information in sort of little manageable bites. So it's paced out over the semester, also with an eye to what are going to be the hot topics at different times. How can we know the flow of the transition process through students' first semester, especially. I've worked with first year students so often I can tell you the exact moment when everybody hates their roommate. So, you know, the stressors just all come to a head. And while it's really their midterms that they're worried about, they're going to take it out on their roommates' quirks, you know, not realizing that their quirks are also getting on their roommates' nerves. So we understand where those peaks and valleys are, and we time our communication to students and reminders to students accordingly. So I want you to know that it's just you parents that we need to kind of corral at one time and try to deliver this information up front in this way. So I hope that kind of explains why we're doing it for you this way. And the students will be surrounded really by these resources and the information. But it does help if they read their email every day. So if there's one habit you can help us ingrain in the students is to know that they get a lot of useful information, sometimes packaged in these nice, pretty e-newsletters, like they get the Navigator e-newsletters on the 1st and the 15th of the month. They'll get an e-newsletter from the Newcomb Tulane Undergraduate College every Friday, and other things that will be coming to them. But sometimes they tune those things out, or they're so used to getting their information and from other mechanisms that they really do need to get on board with us and knowing that email is considered the university's official communication mechanism. They're responsible for following instructions that they get by email. And that's just one of the most compact ways that we can send out information, especially, you know, really thorough, detailed information. So that's really helpful. But they'll see flyers. If we encourage them to use the social media that different departments have to kind of push out information about their services and upcoming programs. They'll hear a lot through word of mouth. But it does take some of them kind of a little while to kind of tune in to what to pay attention to and how to absorb all of that. But that's especially why we have the peer leaders pointing that out and guiding them in that. So it is really time to kind of close. I would say that if you have any last comments that you'd like to put in that are more comments than questions, then here's your last few seconds to do that. But I will also tell you that I really appreciate getting feedback about the webinars. So you can send that to parents@tulane.edu. You have your own email address that you can use, and I'll forward that on to Patrick if that's necessary, or if you want to give feedback or suggestions just about how the webinar went, or if you have suggestions for other topics. We do offer different webinars even after the academic year begins, and they're usually tied to some of those procedures, cyclical kinds of things, so that we can give you sort of just-in-time information, so that you're prepared to enter into a discussion with your student to make decisions about, you know, new phases of their college career or different procedures and things. So, but we appreciate the feedback that you offer. If there are things that you like, you might be gratified to know that there were probably parents 4, 5, 8 years ago who submitted feedback that helped us refine what we're delivering to you now. So I want you to know I kind of take that continuous quality improvement approach and want to keep refining things so that we provide you the support that you need in the way that is helpful. So I think then that we will close, but I'll just remind you that there are those other webinars to take advantage of later, and I hope that you'll join those or watch for them when they're posted. Again, it's easy to remember. The website is parents.tulane.edu. So thanks again for joining us, and thank you so much, Patrick, for being our speaker today, and thanks to all you parents. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks so much.